Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello. From Brandeis University, welcome to Recall This Book, where we assemble scholars and writers from different disciplines to make sense of contemporary issues, problems, and events. I'm one of the hosts, John Plotz, and I'm delighted to be joined today by my wonderful Brandeis colleague, Emily Diouf. Hello, Emily.
Hello, John.
So Emily is a specialist in Anglophone and Francophone African literature, and she's currently working on a really wonderful revisionary monograph about trauma studies and the institutional forces that shape how genocides are represented and understood. Her published articles include The Movement of the Female Body, Reimagining Black Diasporic Women's Writings, and I Just Wanted to Forget It All, But It Was Impossible. So, Emily, it's been such a joy having you as a colleague, and I'm so happy to have you here. And I'd like to pass the baton to you now to have the honor of introducing our honored guest today, Rokhaya Diallo.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me today. I'm honored to be in conversation with Rokhaya Diallo, a French journalist, filmmaker, and anti-racist activist with a focus on Afrofeminism, Islamophobia, white fragility, French identity, and the pitfalls of a form of universalism that denies pluralism. Her work addresses systemic racism, police brutality, and colonial memory. I locate Rokhaya's work in a transnational Black intellectual tradition that can be traced back to the interwar period with the founders like the Nardal sisters, whose literary salon became a meeting ground for African, Antillean, and African-American intellectuals in the Parisian suburbs of Clamart. Although the Nardal sisters were made to disappear in accounts of Black internationalism, Diallo's tenacity and relentless dedication to advocating for racial justice and also gender justice has afforded her a significant place in French public discourse, albeit sometimes a difficult position to uphold as a result of recurrent attacks on her from the far right. Rokhaya Diallo is a versatile thinker with extensive experience in cinema and television. She has directed 8 documentaries, and she is the author of many books, including, most recently, La France, tu l'aimes ou tu la fermes in English, France, Love It or Shut It, which is a collection of her major articles on the struggle against oppression in France and globally. Another book that came out in 2016 is Ne reste pas à ta place, Don't Try to Fit In English, and also a forthcoming book titled Le Dictionnaire amoureux du féminisme, the feminist lover's dictionary, and it is to be released on March 6 with Les Éditions Plomb. Rokhaya, it is a pleasure again.
Thank you for the very kind introduction.
Your work addresses questions of racial justice in France with an intersectional approach. Could you tell us a little bit about your path to this kind of work?
So first of all, thanks to both of you for having me in this podcast. I'm really honored to be able to speak to you and to answer to your questions. I would say that my first questions about race came from my own experience as a French person. I was born and grew up in Paris, and in my early age, I never had to question myself as a French citizen. It was part of myself, and I never doubted. But as a young adult, going to university and studying, I faced questions that I've never asked to myself. People, wondering where I was from, assuming that I was not French, and at the same time, there were many public debates especially about Islam and Muslims, and about the fact that Muslim women shouldn't be visible in the public sphere wearing headscarves and being visibly Muslim. So all coming together, having also news about instances of police brutality that made me, just question my position as a French person, and also how France was unable to see people looking like me. So I'm a Black woman from Senegalese descent, and also to mistreat people who simply wanted to exist as Muslims or just to exist as persons who ultimately would face police violence. So I decided to start an organization first, which name was Les Indivisibles, so inspired by the French Constitution, which states that the French Republic is indivisible. And we decided to use humor to tackle racism as it's widespread in the media. So it was much more a kind of watchdog organization trying to collect all the, most of the racist discourse and using humor. So we created a ceremony. It was a parody to reward the most racist sentences every year. So there was a lot of work. And, of course, people who got the prizes were not happy. But it was a way for us to display systemic racism, not as just, isolated statements, but just as, several sentences that echo themselves and that just built something very systemic. So it was my first appearance in the public sphere, and I was hired then as a contributor to a news morning show, and then I started journalism.
So when you started, there were few Black women, not just to say Black people, in French media. What was the experience for you in carving a space within the French media sphere?
There were few people of color in the media, but at the same time, it was a moment when France was questioning itself and the representation of minorities. It was a few years after the uprisings that started in Clichy-sous-Bois after the death of two teenagers who were chased by the police, and they had done nothing wrong, but they were just chased, and at some point they just got scared and took refuge in a power station, and they died electrocuted. And it really started a wave of unprecedented uprising. And then, so the President Jacques Chirac made a statement about discrimination. It was the first time that such a statement was made at that level. And TV media spaces started to question themselves about how they were unable to represent minorities. So there was a kind of movement. TF1, the channel, hired for the first time an anchor to host the main news show. So his name is Harry Roselmack. It was the direct result of the uprising in 2006. So the uprisings took place in 2005. Before the uprising, there was already an anchor whose name is Audrey Pulvar. She was the first Black person to host a major news show ever. And then after the uprisings, the TV station started to put, Black, Arab people on screen. So when I arrived, it was in this moment when, channels were seeking to have new faces. So it was new for someone like me commenting the news, not only hosting, but giving their opinion on the news, which is usually something that comes with a certain experience and a certain age. And there were not many women commenting the news at that time when I started, especially on the radio. I was in a radio show. And I was we were so few that in every day, there was one woman. They had to dispatch us in order to make sure that there was one woman around the table commenting the news. So I was very young at that time. I was a woman. I was Black, Muslim from the banlieue. I was really different from the rest. So I felt the difference in the way I was not taken seriously at the beginning. So I remember entering rooms where people were looking at me like, what is she doing? Is she sitting with us? And being also constantly interrupted when I was speaking. That was most of my experience. Just, I don't know how many times I have said, I have not finished my sentence. Could you stop interrupting me, please? It's the thing I've said the most publicly.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I've seen you, but you hold your ground. And I want to come back to a point you made about, being, Black Muslim women of African descent. and, working in, along with a society and having dreams, right? When I talk to Black women activists, intellectual, I like to really think about dreamscapes, because it takes a lot of courage to have a vision for a country, for your country, and to see how that vision can expand beyond the borders of its country. But not everyone sees that vision as one that is for all. So I want to connect that point to the existence of Afrofeminism. Now, how French people or scholars of French feminism of African descent think of what kind of feminism they're involved in. So it's not new, right? They were organizing. There were also people working intellectually. I'm thinking of the Audre Lorde research circle. But it was depoliticized. And I recall a comment you made yesterday that there was a march and Tunisian or women of Arab descent were actually forbidden to participate in it because they were wearing burqas. So now I would like to ask about what is, or where is movement building in Afrofeminism or French feminism in general?
Yeah, so actually there was the march that you mentioned was in the early 2000s, and those were women from North African descent wearing a hijab. It was just a simple headscarf, and they were physically kicked off the march because some women thought that they were unable to be part of the feminist movement. So it has changed, but that was the moment when I really decided to be involved, to actually leave the mainstream feminism, because I couldn't stand that kind of behavior, and to think more about race and the colonial legacy even in those kind of movements. And as you said, there have been Black feminist movements in France for a long time, of course in the colonies. But even in the French mainland in the 70s, there was a Coordination des Femmes Noires. And there was a book written by Awa Thiam, a Senegalese student at that time, which name was La Parole aux Négresses. And, it was part of the movement for the liberation of women. So it was one part. But it was also erased from history. And it took the younger generation of Afrofeminists in the 2010s to dig into history and make it visible to the public sphere. So what was your question again?
I was wondering about movement building.
Yes, so I have to say that many things in the late 15 years happened online. Especially in the Afrofeminist movement. Many women from African descent, from Caribbean descent, started to testify online about who they were and how it was to be a Black woman in the French space. And they connected in those spaces, and actually they coined the term Afrofeminist. It's very specific to that generation of Black feminists. It didn't exist before, and it really thought to speak about those French and some also Belgian French-speaking feminists. So I think that even for myself, social media has been instrumental in helping me remaining visible in the public sphere, because it was a space where I could, I could share my views. I could also protest when there was a controversy, when there was, mainstream media coming after me. I could also share my own views. And yes, I think that much part of the movement building is building online communities and making it global. I wouldn't be here if my work hadn't been able to travel. I do write for the Washington Post, and the editor who identified me, Karen Atia, identified me on Twitter. She heard about me just reading about what I was saying about France on Twitter. So it's also a new way for certain bodies of work to travel, because mainstream intellectuals have access to traditional media, and when they do so, they don't really face challenging questions as I do. But I have a strong online platform which helps me remaining visible.
Can I Can I just ask how you think about that in the context? I mean, here in the United States, we're just thinking so much about the pernicious effects of Twitter right now because we see how the far right has capitalized on it. And, you know, the extreme example, of course, being Elon Musk, but a very representative extreme example. But I completely hear what you're saying. I mean, you can also amplify voices and build platforms on the left. But how do you think about doing that in this hostile ecosystem?
I have conflicting views on that. Of course, it's a space. Even before the far right, took over X, it was already a space of attacks of cyberbullying. I was the first person in France to sue someone for harassing me on Twitter. It was on 2013, and I won actually my trial because we were able to identify the person and to find their informations. But so it's always been a space of violence for me, but. It's also a space of resistance. Movements like the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, they really they were born online, and they couldn't have been so big if they were not started online. And at the same time, it's very difficult to maintain certain views in those spaces because not only the far right has taken over, but it's designed to promote their views. The algorithm brings much more visibility to certain opinions. So there is this ongoing debate about, should we leave X or not? I haven't, because I've built a strong community, and to me, leaving would be also losing an opportunity to speak directly to tens of thousands of people. I would not be able to do so if I, used other platforms. So I try to navigate. It's not easy, but even the mainstream media, many of them are not okay. I used to work for a channel that was owned by a billionaire who funds the far right. So it's like, should I go there or not? And the show I was part of was so successful that to me it was a platform that was very strong. So I'm aware of, the space I navigate, but I don't think that you can just question social media without questioning the rest of the media, because mainstream media are also owned by people who want no good for our democracies. And if we leave X, why not leaving the group of channels owned by Vincent Bolloré, who is the billionaire who really in France has built the public visibility of the far right. So it's yes, but I'm trying to also build for myself alternative spaces. So it's it's difficult.
May I ask what those alternative spaces look like?
Yes, of course. It's like physical spaces, for example, trying to just, if I can speak to tens of thousands of people at the same time, why not gathering them, for example? Just when I have and I also have a podcast, Kif Taras, which was the first French-speaking podcast on race, and it's it's very successful. I'm glad I co-host it with Grace Lee, who is also a French woman. She's from Asian descent, and we've been listened by millions of people. We've created a show out of that podcast. So trying to create different forms of public appearance, and also using social media to leverage the spaces that we have created for our own. But it's, I don't think I would survive media-wise if there were no social media.
So I see this, there's been a trend that we blame social media for political polarization mainly. What you are saying is that there is still space to be carved within these digital spaces, digital forums, to actively carry on a conversation, and a conversation that can hopefully be conducive to transformation, to positive transformation, and also social media as being also a place where different types of gatherings, especially in feminist organizing across national borders. And I can attest to this in Senegal. In fact, some of the most kind of outspoken organizers don't live in the country, but because of social media, because of WhatsApp groups, we're constantly communicating. And so that creates a synergy between what's happening in the spaces where we are located, but also what's happening across in our respective, places of origins. So, but what I've been wondering about is how do these, spaces of feminist organizing, especially across the African diaspora, what I like to think of as the global African diaspora, how can they materialize or translate into revamping the left wherever we are? I know it's a big question, but I've been wondering about it.
We have 30 hours.
At least. Wow. It's very difficult. It's not easy because I've always thought that marginalized voices should be at the center of any left movements. And it's the case for Afro-feminist movements or Black feminist movement, but it's the case for any marginalized voice. So it's the fact that they're only included and sometimes somehow listened to, but not centered. To me, is an issue because there is nothing you can do if you don't take into account those voices and elaborate any plan based on their experience. So it means, of course, people of color, but also people disabled, LGBTQIA plus people, any marginalized community has an experience of the world that must be central to any left thinking.
Thank you for that. And, this reminds me of a point that Angela Davis made years ago. I think this was in 2018. He gave a talk at, this was in 2019, the 50th anniversary of the African Studies department here at Brandeis. And one of the things she mentioned was, to think of justice at a global scale requires really dealing with the questions of intersections, the different intersections. How do we think of race, gender, sexuality, disability, and the many intersecting points? And again, it was another point made the prior year or 2 years before by Kimberly Crenshaw, who was also speaking at Brandeis. And so, but it is so hard to really think of being taken seriously when I'm just thinking of your experience with the French far right and with your detractors who accuse you of fostering division and rupturing cultural relations or social relations by being anti-white.
Yes, and it would be okay if it was only the far right, but it's like the left. In France, the left is very active in defining Islamophobia. They have been the ones invoking the principles of the French Republic to build actually all the ideas against the public visibility of Islam, because there is a strong anti-religious sentiment on the left that has been reinterpreted as a kind of, and also the idea of colorblindness has led to a left that is very anti-minorities at the end of the day. To them, any manifestation of something that doesn't really echo white supremacy is problematic. So, because there is this idea of colorblindness that doesn't really recognize the fact that there is systemic racism, and that that results to the erasure of the experience of people of color. So, many of the people who attack me actually are not from the far right; they are from that kind of liberal part of the political spectrum. And they accuse me of dividing the society and of importing a lens that belongs to the US. Because in France, we're not supposed to have issues related to race, which is amazing because it's a very racialized country. France is the only country to be present on 4 continents because many of its former colonies are now French departments. So how is that possible without having anything to do with race? France is in the Caribbean, in Oceania, in South America. Like the only place that is still controlled by Europe in South America is the French Guiana. There is no other parts of that territory that is still owned by, controlled by a European nation. So not seeing race and at the same time having race being, in so many different places is a form of denial that is central to the French racism. So, yes, the attacks I get are they come from multiple places.
Can I connect that to another big question, which is like the sort of the fate of the left version, another version of that question? Emily and I were talking prior to this conversation about where the vision comes from now to revitalize the left. Because when I look at the right, they actually seem to be on the same page with one another, which is kind of amazing. Like the notion of an internationalist ethnonationalism is slightly terrifying. I mean, if you look at how can Israel and Elon Musk be making common cause, but somehow they've pulled it off. What is there a vision of that on the left, do you suppose, or is it just fracture right now?
I think that there is a vision, but the vision is it's not mainstream and it's demonized. What the far right succeeded to do is to make their concerns mainstream. So what we can hear on the left is that immigration is a problem. Like it's so common. So the question is not anymore are we in favor or against immigration, is how we should fight immigration. And it's even on the left, is like the most basic question. And it's an ideological victory from the far right, because if your problem is people, being able to travel from a country to another, you're lost in your values. And there are so many other parts of the far right ideology that has been made acceptable to the left. So we need to, on the left, I think that we need to be able to stand on our values, and not to be afraid of being labeled naive or of dreaming too much. We are the ones who are supposed to dream and who are supposed to offer a vision of the world that is idealistic. So to defy capitalism, to think about a world where the place where you are born would not define the rest of your life forever, and it's something that we are missing. And the parties that offer that kind of visions are seen as not really serious, and the idea of seriousness is tied to fitting the concerns of the right. If you do not you do not respond to what preoccupy them, you're not being serious. You cannot handle a country. You cannot govern a country, and that's the problem that we have. Being going back more and more for decades.
Yeah. So in some way to engage absurdity, that you to really inhabit this, something that might be perceived as less serious. I want to kind of link this point to your work, right? That you're starting with humor and satire to actually address very fraught questions. Your film, Les Marches pour la Liberté, but also the other film that actually I think emerged from this observation of a global movement building happening on social media, with your film From Paris to Ferguson, in English, Not Your Mama's Movement, in 2016. I notice a turn in how you explore questions of racial justice, but, justice in general, that you are now going with a comparative approach that I think has always been in your work, but this took it outside of the borders of France. Can you tell us what prompted you to do that?
When you want to engage with anti-racism in a theoretical way, you really quick, even if you're not in the US, you really quickly come across scholars from the US, and it's like the most easily accessible form of thinking that you can go to. And in France, as I told you, whenever you try to speak about race, you're accused of being brainwashed by the US, of speaking about things that don't really apply. So I wanted to, even if our countries are different, the US were invaded by people from Europe. And the racial theories were created in Europe. So there is a connection. And I wanted to show that even if our countries are different, there are some connections, and the result is systemic racism in both sides of the Atlantic. So in my first documentary, The Steps to Liberty, I followed a group of Americans who went to France, most of them for the first time, and discovered France through the lens of race. And they came having that idealized image of Paris with the Seine River, the Eiffel Tower, the Champs-Élysées, and whatever, and discovered that we had much more in common than they thought. And it's always interesting to see that there is the image of the country and what people actually experience. And to me, it was a way to say that, okay, we're different, but it's not absurd to compare the two countries, because France is also present in the American continent. There are French departments like Martinique, Guadeloupe, who are there. So we are in some ways American. There is also the French Guiana that I mentioned earlier. So that's my way of showing that systemic racism has no borders, and that it's been traveling, back and forth from Europe to the US, and actually feeding, each other's form from one side of the Atlantic to the other. So that's why I like to compare and there have been so many connections, African Americans coming to France to settle and to escape the segregation, and at the same time, I know so many scholars of color from France who want to work on race and who have to expatriate and to go to the US because it's not possible to do so in France. So there's been that ongoing conversation for decades.
I'm also, fascinated with this comment. I'm also fascinated with, the idea of mobility in relation to Black internationalism. We had the waves of the 20s, James Baldwin, Josephine Baker. Then you also brought up in your talk when Angela Davis, at the time a Brandeis student, went on a study abroad to France, and there realized that in France, her racialization was actually she was perceived as an Algerian woman, or easily perceived as such. And so in relation to these kinds of mobility and contemporary forms of mobility, what I find is that when mobility is invoked as a lens to think of justice, transnationally, it brings forth discussions of place, politics, their complex and contingent kind of interrelations. So here, I guess, I just wanted to hear your views about what does it mean to think of, again, re-energizing this kind of, or facing the backlash of democratic backlash. What I find fascinating and also as an irony is that when it comes to African elections, like last year with Senegal's elections, everybody was talking about democratic backlash in West Africa. But you don't hear that term being used for Europe, or it wouldn't be used for Germany or the United States.
Yes.
So what does mobility do to this guy?
It's insane because yes, last year in France we had a snap election that were provoked by the President Emmanuel Macron. And for the parliamentary elections, the left came first, but we never had a prime minister from the left, and to me it's an infringement of democracy that was never named in that way. So we ended up having two prime ministers from the right, center right, but to me they are from the right, and all the government from the rightest form of right. So it's and it has nothing to do with what was actually voted by the citizens, even if the far right had strong numbers in the polls and in the elections. The government doesn't look like what was decided by the people, and you would never hear anyone saying that France is, being being concerned about the French democracy, and as they should. And regarding what you said about, how having a global perspective or being able to travel helps building a kind of perspective, a strength. It's interesting because, yes, there is that myth that France was so welcoming to people of color and to black people in the early 20th century, which was the case for African Americans, but it was in the same time as France was a very brutal colonial power. So some people made it to France and had a very positive experience, but it was not all positive. For example, you mentioned Josephine Baker and James Baldwin. Josephine Baker, she was part of a show that was supposed to mock African people, and she was not even African. She was African American, but she didn't come from Africa, and she played in different films in which she could be Tunisian, she could be Tahitian, and she was always in love with some white man who didn't love her back. So there was also this idea of not being lovable as a black woman, and she was then afterwards part of the resistance, and she's a very strong figure, but her experience was not always positive. And regarding Baldwin, when he came to France, he struggled. He didn't have money. He was accused of stealing in a hotel. He was arrested, went on a trial. And he also understood what was going on with Algeria, because he was in France. He was there during the Algerian Revolution and during the time when the government decided to put some very restrictive policies and measures against Algerians who were in France. Same with Angela Davis, who was there when Algeria ultimately won the war against France and gained independence. So being able to travel also helps building a global perspective and understanding our nations in a much more broader way. So to me, being able to come here in the US gives much strength to my work, and especially writing about France for outlets that are not French. It's very, very helpful, because of course it gives me credit in my country, because it's always the same. You need to have some recognition out of your country to be seen in your country, but it's also a kind of no country wants to look bad abroad. So writing not positively about France also make people not really happy.
Do you still see a strong role for humor and satire?
I do. There is a very, very interesting scene of stand-up in France. And I think that many of the stand-uppers are the ones who really tell about systemic racism in France in the best way, in the most accurate way. I'd say that, humor had been at the center of many controversies. Last year there was a comedian who was fired from the public radio for his statements on Netanyahu. So, interestingly, I would say that the most controversial people now are comedians in France, and they are the ones who allow themselves to tell about what's going on. Yes.
Well, it's interesting. You were speaking about the power of social media, but also the power of in-person gathering. And humor is an interesting example of a genre that does very well in social mediation, like YouTube clips or something.
Yes.
Or Richard Pryor had stand-up records in the 70s, but it also is it's still a live club thing.
Exactly, and I think that at some point we really need to laugh and to find joy in different places. So gathering, laughing together, laughing off the far right is also a very strong tool of power, and I've never seen any comedian from the far right, for example, and maybe there are some, but I don't think they're funny.
You mentioned humor, and I also asked this, as I said earlier, to everyone's just a visionary. What are your dreams for yourself? For the world we are in now.
Of course, my dream would be that anyone could be the person that they would like to be without feeling the pressure of the society, without having to deal with the legacy of a history that is bigger than them. So I think that we have the right to choose who we are, what we would like to do, and how we would like to be seen and to be told about. So yes, that would be my dream, to have a choice, that anyone would have a choice.
That's beautiful. It brought chills to my body.
So we love to close the show with something we call recallable book. And so basically the question is, for people who have enjoyed this conversation today, do you have a book, something from your own historical recovery work, or just a book from the past that you would recommend that people who listen to this might also want to read?
I love fiction, and there is a book that is now 20 years old, which is authored by Faiza Gen, and the name of the book in English is Just Like Tomorrow. In French is Kif Kif Demain, and she was 18 when she wrote that book.
Wow.
She's from Pantin, which is in the suburbs of Paris, and the book has been translated into 20 plus languages. She was on the cover of the New York Times, and she was just a teenager who had no idea about how her book would be received. And it's a very funny book, very very dynamic, and I like the main character. So it's and she's from Algerian descent. So yes.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you. What a wonderful recommendation. So I don't think anything remains but just to thank you so much for this conversation. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. The questions were amazing. Thank you.
Recall This Book is the creation of John Plotz and Elizabeth Ferry. Sound editing is by Kamaya Bagla, and music comes from a song by Eric Chaslow and Barbara Cassidy. We gratefully acknowledge support from Brandeis University and its Mandel Center for the Humanities. We always want to hear from you with your comments, criticisms, or suggestions for future episodes. Finally, if you enjoyed today's show, please forward it to 5 people or write a review and rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.